Hey, good to be back. Um, this is more difficult I was than I led myself to believe. Being able to have content that is worth paying attention to in hour-long segments is going to take some building up to on my part. I've talked to some really interesting people who are have committed actually to being on this podcast and having conversations with me about the kinds of things that older people, at 70, we are the equivalent of old in our parents' generation. It's not the same being 70 in 2019 as being 70 in 1969 or 1959 or 1949 or any time earlier. 70 was much older in my youth than 70 is in my maturity. And finishing what we did up to now, for me, that left me with not much to do. I didn't accomplish what I had planned to accomplish in my life. I didn't write the great American novel. I never really planned to. I only talked about doing it. And truth is, I have probably written it, but it won't be discovered for another 100 years or, 10 years after I die or something like that. But there are, 50,000 pages of Ken Pepiton writings floating around in cyberspace in several places. But I wrote this book in the early 90s. And at that time, I was a very active Christian in a growing church that had about less than 300 people at the time. And it's grown to be a church of 3 to 5,000 by now, but I haven't gone to church there in 10 years or more. Nevertheless, during this time, there was a political scene that was happening. There were Christian candidates, and people were remembering Ronald Reagan as if he had saved America. And I had come out of being basically a monk for 15 years in a cult, but no, a cult's a cult. This one, 15, 20, 30 years after I left it, the guy who started it went to prison for being a child molester. And this was the guy who had ostensibly led me to Jesus. The good thing that came out of that, though, in the cult was that for a number of years, one of the rules was that you needed to read the first 5 chapters of the book of Proverbs in the Bible every day. I must have done that at least 10 years. I read at least the first 5 chapters of Proverbs every day. And then after I left that cult, and this was the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation, and I went in there a year and 3 months after I got back from Vietnam, and I stayed there from July 5th of 1970 until around June 25th of 1985. So we're going to talk somewhat about being old after you got old and getting things done. But getting things done for me means every day for a while I need to put something up on YouTube, and it needs to have some value. This book is downloadable for free at mytechpeople.com. And when I get better at this, I'll learn how to put URLs and stuff on the screen. But let me read you the final statement in this book, the epilogue. And I introduced it with a quote from a guy named Edgar Lee Masters, who wrote a poem about Johnny Appleseed. "It's every bit the truth," said Johnny Appleseed. "A man must fight for the thing he loves, to possess it, to keep it, be it apples, freedom, or heaven itself," said Johnny Appleseed. After some time and several revisions, my little book has become in its own way controversial. I wrote that in 1995. That's good. Readers have informed me that I made two of history's humanist arch-heretics into 18th century versions of what is called the radical Christian right these days. I counter by saying that I never intended to revise history. I intended to provoke research of history. The humanists who claim Franklin and Jefferson in their ranks should ponder some of the ideas these men were willing to die for. The Christians who judge them heretics and pagans should look closer to home for opportunities to correct history. The great volumes Franklin and Jefferson wrote regarding democracy and republicanism and religion and education are hardly touched in these few pages. You'll have to read those volumes or at least a good piece of them, before you decide to disregard this little book's main character and let the current crop of history manipulators convince your children that there was no truly sacred honor involved in the birth of our nation. I know I dealt a little with personal faults of Franklin. I know he had faults. I dealt little with them in my little book. I was interested mostly in what advice I could obtain from this man whose autobiography I read and realized that he was writing that to his own son, with whom at the time he was becoming separated ideologically. Franklin's son remained a loyalist, while Franklin essentially invented America. You know, the idea that most common people have of America is much closer to Benjamin Franklin's idea of what America was going to be than it is to, say, John Adams or even Jefferson. Jefferson, at 33 years old, wrote the Declaration of Independence. 33 years old. He basically articulated a new form of government, a new way for people to live together in harmony. It depended on the people being literate, and America became the most literate country in the world. In the 19th century, Americans, for the most part, could tell you why being an American was different than being anything else. This was a whole new way of looking at nobility and aristocracy and peasants and poverty and peons. People of my social class 3 generations ago were the equivalent of indentured servants. They were sharecroppers. On both sides of my family, the people were at that economic status. Now, I am, by any scale of comparison to my grandparents, I am a rich man. Physically, I can't do half the things my grandfather knew how to do. My grandfather knew how to make horseshoes and put the horseshoes on the horses and build the wagon that the horses would pull, or the plow that the horses would use to scrape the old dry dirt down on the big sandy river that was mostly sand in Wickiup, Arizona. There are good stories that are going to come out about my family and what they left to me and what I am going to leave to my grandchildren. That was the dedication in this book, to my children's children. So I know I dealt little with the personal faults of Franklin. His son was probably illegitimate, the way they argue it, but legitimacy means nothing in reality. I mean, there are some silly things that we have evaluating laws about. Like, if you didn't get the license to get married from somebody who was in a position that gave them the right to require you to get a license to get married, then your children are in that legislative arena, that country, that society. Your children are bastards. So what these days, right? I mean, I think around the time that I was writing this book, I worked for the Department of Social Services in San Diego, and a great deal of the population in San Diego was born out of wedlock. Big percentage. I think, the stats are probably all over the internet. We can talk about why and how that happened. But one of the things that Benjamin Franklin mentioned in his autobiography was a time when he was sitting at a table with somebody, I don't know who, and he was drinking Madeira wine from the islands of Portugal off in the Atlantic. And a fly landed in his wine, and he took the fly out and he just laid it on the table, and after a while the fly dried out and flew away. And Franklin, when he was thinking about this, made a note in his journal that he then transferred to his autobiography, that wouldn't it be a good experiment or a good thing to do to be able to be pickled in Madeira wine and 200 years later have the casket open and be revived to see what had happened to the experiment of the American dream. Well, I've always fancied that he would come by my house and I would show him, this is what it happens for people who were reared to believe that enough and enough to share, that's prosperity. That's the way I was reared, and we're going to talk about that. But let me finish the epilogue, just because I have accomplished what I intended to accomplish today. I have created a YouTube upload that I won't be ashamed of in 50 years. So I did deal little with the personal faults of Franklin. He had some. I know he had faults and failures. But he planted the seed of the dream all the world calls America. And as de Tocqueville said, America is great because America is good. When America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. The seed was good, still is. For teachers and professors to stand before students and disavow the role of faith in the decisions of the signers of the Declaration of Independence is a violation of trust and the uprooting of the finest crop of free men and women ever to breathe Earth's air. We might call it a spiritual abortion. This book is not revisionist, it is visionist. I wrote the book to plant the good seed I found in an effort to change tomorrow, not yesterday. The personal values both Franklin and Jefferson held on their deathbeds were not vastly different than the values held by those men at 20 or even 50. But experience taught both men that often we know less about things pertaining to God than we say we know. And conversely, we often know more about things pertaining to God than we say we know. As the old philosopher told his mother and Jesus told the Pharisees, and I pointed out to my readers in this little book, none of us will be judged either here or in the hereafter by what we or anyone else said we did. We won't be judged by what people say we do. We will be judged by what we do. Wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. Matthew 7:20. I don't memorize chapters and verse, but I wrote it in the book. The person is deceived who believes the stories about the faith of our founding fathers and believes their radical Christian revisionism. Any person who believes the men who signed the Declaration of Independence and pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to establish it were really only humanists out for their own self-indulgent needs. Any person who believes that has never dreamed the dream, nor seen the vision. I wrote the book for those people. Without a vision, my people perish. Any Christians who have chosen to believe that the founders were all deist heretics whose ideas have no place in a Christian nation should take the 13-week course that I outlined in here based on Franklin's own little book that he used to govern his own life. They need the exercise in self-examination. I wrote this book for those people, and I'm giving it away to whoever wants it. mytechpeople.com, it's there. There's also a PDF of William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and the images all came from the British Library and they were put into the public domain last year. I said, well, if these belong to everybody now, I may as well share them with everybody. But because they were done with watercolors, hand-mixed watercolors that Blake made himself, they're difficult to read in digitally on a screen and the way he wrote them. So I typed the poems. So they're there as there's a page with just the poem itself written in regular fonts that you can easily read, and then the illustration that Blake put up. That's on mytechpeople.com as well. And I'll learn to make all these transitions where you're bringing in pictures and showing people and all that. I actually have the tools. I'm sitting in front of a studio editing system that is more sophisticated than the studio editing system that I used in college in the early 90s. Grossmont College, community college. Uh, and I took television studio production courses with cameras that weighed 130 pounds, three CCD cameras that probably had 32 pixels per inch or something. They weren't very good cameras, but they were expensive. And the switchers were expensive. And there was no such thing as digital video. Everything was sort of analog. But I digress, and you'll notice that I do that a lot. Last set of people that I wrote this book for, finally, in the future, any person who was a child in the old days when this book was written, 1990s, man, that's 30 years ago now. Those are the old days. Those are the old days. You know, that was like when I was in high school, that would have been the Elliot Ness days, 30 years before. The Al Capone and all that kind of stuff. 30 years before that, my grandparents, my grandfather, had come from Texas to Arizona in a covered wagon that his father built. And we'll tell some stories about my great-grandfather, Mac Boyette. Mac Boyette was a bedroll cowboy in the post-World War, post-Civil War. Born in 1857, he was a cowboy during the Lincoln County Wars. My research hasn't told me yet which side he was on, but one of the places that he claims to have known was the L4D range. Now, L4D means to me left 4 dead. Just has for 50 years. L4D with the numeral 4. And he said the L4D, you could see a pond out there, and his daughter said, what's the name of this place? Looks like a lake. He says, oh, that's the lake of alkali, illusion, and mirage. This was 1917. He was 60 years old. He's telling his 15-year-old daughter, yeah, I've been here before. This is L4D Ranch. And that's the lake of alkali and illusion and mirage. Well, from that man, I learned to plow. And now I'm broadcasting. I'm just scattering the seed. The ideas that I'm willing to share, I got from people who shared them with me, and they're good ideas. I mean, I am not going to turn you into a tongue-talking Christian who agrees with everything whoever on TV is saying about Jesus, or about Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or Joe Rogan, or there are a lot of people who are paying attention to the world that we live in right now, and they are doing their best to help their hearers, their listeners, their watchers, to help you to do things differently than you've done them up to now if you're not happy with the things that resulted from what you did before now. If the seed you sowed brought forth a bad crop, it's not too late to sow another crop. That's why I was led. I really do think that. I mean, I had the idea back in the 1990s to sow a seed that would bring forth fruit in my old age. And the fruit that I wanted to bring forth is joy. Joy, really, our strength. The joy of Yahweh is our strength. That's the clue. You don't have to be in some kind of rites or mystical society to believe that, nope, the world is just a little bit too finely put together, too precise for it to be an accident. And I won't be convinced by anybody who can't make me understand how they know how a cork works. If they can't make me understand how they know that spooky action at a distance, who designed that? I mean, how could that happen accidentally? That is a really, really delicate relationship for any sort of material to have. The relationship that the two pieces of a cork have when they are entangled and they are separated by, who knows, some guys say forever, right? This entanglement idea that we are entangled with, we're entangled with the very idea that brought us into being. And somehow, since you're on the planet at the same time as me and my words are being heard by you, you and I are entangled. You will never be able to say that you did not hear me say whatever. If I lie to you, you'll have to confess, either believing the lie or catching me in the lie. And if you catch me in the lie and you correct me, you show me the right way to do it, and don't leave me just hanging off over there not knowing what I'm saying or doing, believing a lie. Because the liar, if he believes the lie, you might be able to help him by revealing the lie. If he doesn't believe the lie but he tells it anyway, he might get elected president. Anyway, in the future, any person who was a child in the old days when this book was written and may have by now been robbed of your American heritage, the American dream. This book was written for you. Take the time to read and take the time to see the world you live in. Refuse to say you know the things that your teachers say they know until you know. Refuse to say the things that your teachers say they know until you know those things, until they have actually taught you those things and you have weighed the facts with the actions ostensibly attributed to those facts, causes and effects. When you know it, share it. Sell it if you need to, but somehow get to point out that, hey, there's a lie that a whole bunch of people over yonder are believing. Don't believe it. I checked it out. It's not true. A bunch of ones like that are going to come up over the years in the future. Guests are going to come in and they're going to talk to me about how we learned that war is not good for anybody. Never was, never will be. War is not a solution to the kinds of problems that human beings have. War is the problem that human beings have. So refuse to say that you know the things your teachers say they know until you know them. If you claim you know things you do not know, you could end up believing lies. Some teachers have done that. Look for the evidence of unalienable rights that Jefferson and Franklin and millions have held to be self-evident. And look for the creature whom the Creator endowed with these unalienable rights. Jefferson wanted to say they were sacred and undeniable, but Ben Franklin scratched out sacred and undeniable and he put in the word self-evident. We actually have the document. We've got the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. We can see where this 70-year-old man and this 33-year-old man were imagining America. How can we make this thing work? How can we break these bonds between us and the old idea of kings and priests ruling people, when in fact it is self-evident that every person on the planet was given by God, by the Creator, by whoever figured out how to make stuff work. I mean, we are complicated. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. The world we live in is complicated. The universe we live in is complicated. There are many, many layers of things that must happen, and they must happen simultaneously, and they must happen over really, really broad spans of space. And if they're broad spans of space, they're broad spans of time. So many little influences that are changing the way you and I think. We live in the times when knowledge have been increased. There has never been a time in history where a man with my financial resources or my education or my status in society could potentially speak to 2 billion people. The internet works that way. And Seth Godin's idea of the idea virus back in like 1998, this guy infected me. That if you have an idea that can do something, it can make something happen, sow your seed. That's what I'm doing. Dare to dream the American dream. It was never anything but an idea held by persons that know nothing is impossible. And all things are possible with God. Hey, come back. Let's learn some more things together. We're going to talk about the Book of the Hopi, which is being read by me at anchor.fm/Ken Pepiton, I think, but you can search once you get to anchor.com. The Book of the Hopi was written in 1963 by Frank Waters in New Mexico, and my reading of it is not some official sanction from them. It's just that the book's hard to find these days, or it was when I found this one. This is a replacement for one I carried with me walking to Chicago and all the hitchhiking that went on in the 1969. I had the Book of the Hopi with me for no reason other than it was cool. But now you go through it 50 years later and you're reading this and saying, oh my God, this whole culture has essentially disappeared in my lifetime. Completely disappeared in the lifetime of my grandfather. When he was 17 and coming, 18, coming from Texas to Arizona, they went through Hopi country and saw some of the paintings and rock art. And my brother died a few years ago, and I went over some of these. He lived in southern Arizona, between Southern California and southern Arizona. I knew there were some places where the Hopis had marked junctions with rocks. There's a painted rock monument on out in the desert east of Yuma on Interstate 8. And it's only 4 or 5 miles off the highway. And if you go up there, you will witness the evidence of the story that these people tell about their migration. Their migration myth and the purpose of their migration myth is easily the same purpose that was in any other migration myth you happen to read. The one we're most familiar with is the one of Moses leading the children of Israel out of the wilderness. But it's, started with Abraham coming from Ur of the Chaldees. It was a migration myth. By reading the Hopi's migration myth, you can get some sense of we're not so different. The good ideas that we carried with us, those good old ways that things are supposed to be done, that Jeremiah told the Jews back around 600 BC. He said, find the old way where good is and walk in it. Jeremiah 6:16. And people said, no. Hey, see you in the future.